Alright, hello everybody. Today is Thursday, October the 31st. It's Halloween, 2024. And, I'm making an astrology video, obviously. The stuff we're working with today in terms of astrology, we have Mercury in Scorpio has just made an aspect recently to the planet Uranus. Opposition from Mercury in Scorpio to Uranus and Taurus. Mercury is also applying to a trine with Neptune in Pisces right now. At the same time, Venus in Sagittarius is in the middle of a T-square with Saturn and Neptune in Pisces and Jupiter in Gemini in retrograde motion. And so that's like a lot of stuff going on. But I thought the most significant thing is that the Mercury contacts between Mercury and Neptune and Mercury and Uranus are pretty strong. And the Saturn-Neptune is making conjunctions to a lot of stuff as well. And so it's kind of like, admittedly, it's a bit of a mess in terms of having a one coherent aspect for this video. But there was something about the Neptune-Uranus dynamic and how that's being set off by Mercury that I was thinking about the... well, I have something in mind anyways. I have to admit, though, that with Mercury and all this water, basically, right? Like, we have a very literal... we've had all the flooding recently, all the hurricanes and whatnot. There's a very literal physical manifestation of these grand water trines happening. And now, with this Mercury's also in a trine to Mars. So we have this is it. I'll make this, whatever. There's too much astrology going on. We have a grand water trine between Mercury, Mars, and Neptune right now. We also have Mercury opposite Uranus, which is basically a kite. And then we have the T-square between Venus, Saturn, and Jupiter. Although that's a bit more loose. So just off the bat, we've got a lot of stuff going on. I have to admit that with all the water, I enter into this particular video not really in the best mood. So there's something about Halloween that gets me a little bit cranky, but I realize, I think maybe this helps, like, I've been doing this sort of, like, IFS therapy, that there's, like, maybe different parts that like, when you're cranky, it's like you're blended with some part, this kind of identification that's cranky. And for me, a lot of this has to do with the associations of Halloween with being a child and trick-or-treating, or being an adolescent and going out partying. And I have to admit that approaching doing a video today, it was kind of like the Kinder Egg, right? Where you have your outer shell that to penetrate through to get to the toy inside, but the outer shell seems just to be a lot of like hang-ups and emotional baggage around. I don't really understand. Like, there's some part of me that feels left out because it's not going to party or something like that. But if you look at the way that Halloween works, is that you've got what you do as a little kid, a child, and your little children friends, and then you have this sort of age of adolescence where you're more like getting messed up, you're drinking and doing drugs and partying, and then you have adulthood where you are presumably a parent and you have to look after your little kids who want to go trick-or-treating or do this or that other thing, and that the whole idea of adolescence is really kind of like a cultural construction, because in other cultures you may not have had this kind of period of adolescence so much. You may have just had, you're either a child or you were an adult, and if you can get into a bar and if you can drink alcohol, you are an adult, and if you're behaving like an adolescent adult, it's still adulthood, right? But there's this basic kind, and there's also, of course, the whole thing about COVID, and I don't know, I just haven't been, okay, all that out of the way, there's some other important factor here in that relating to making an astrology video that is, I want to put out something that's actually of value, that's actually making a contribution, that I'm not just, I'm entering into it with these emotions, for some reason just feeling cranky about Halloween, like a cranky old man who's upset that he's not a child anymore or something like that. But I have to admit, there's a certain sense of being sort of like, it brings me back to like, why do astrology at all in the first place? And there's a certain sense of being like out of time. And I have to admit that this may also go with the fact of, to put it bluntly, perhaps more bluntly than necessary, being mentally ill, right? And I mentioned in a previous video reading, one of the books I read this year was Dhalgren by Samuel Delany. And in Dhalgren, one of the things that I found about this book was relatable in some way, was that the main protagonist in the book, okay, admittedly, the character in the book is maybe 10 years younger than I am, right? But the idea is that they call this character the Kid because he has a young face, or that he's often mistaken for being maybe like 10 years younger than he is. And one of the things, part of the plot things about this character, is that the Kid is mentally ill, had actually spent some time in a mental institution or something like that. And there's this kind of idea of like, that the age you wear on your face, or how you present yourself to the world, it may not be so much your actual literal physical age, but if you are taken out of the stream of life that everybody else is in. And in this, I mean, they don't really have these asylums and institutions anymore, right? But if you were like, let's say, just locked up in a asylum and you're taken outside of out of the stream that everybody else is in, then there's this kind of idea that you kind of have this baby face, or that you look a lot younger because you're not living the same adult life that everybody else is living, right? And there's something about what happened in my life is that a lot of people have a psychosis in their adolescent leading into adulthood. And for me, it was kind of like that, but it was basically around the age of 24 years old, which is a bit later than other people have psychosis or mental health crisis. But there's something about this, when I had it anyways, it could have been brought on by me being young and partying and doing too many drugs and stuff like that. And there's some direct association to me with this and like Halloween, because this whole kind of thing about like it's Halloween. What do you do in Halloween? Well, I'm not a little kid, so I would go out and party. And for me, there's a sort of thing about being like, but I'm not going to be going out and partying because it's not good for me to go out and do a whole bunch of drugs and get messed up and stuff like that, because that is the kind of thing that led me to mental health crisis in the first place, and taking me out of that stream of life where that is considered normal adult behavior, basically, right? so there's this kind of sense of being kind of like out of time, or feeling like I am, like, it's kind of just strange relating to Halloween from the perspective of like there's some part of me that is like identifies with being like that young, like early 20s, and if it's like the way I'm conditioned to just think about life, the way I'm thinking, okay, it's Halloween. What does Halloween mean? It means you go out and party as if you're in your early 20s. And then when I was that age, I met a girlfriend who had kids, right? So even you're out there partying, the people that you're partying with might be adults who have children, right? Or they might be, that you're not really an adolescent. You're out there with a bunch of adults of mixed different ages, and they're doing this thing called partying, and I'm just there's something about like there's something about that whole culture, and not just there's an idea that as I was having a psychosis, I had got it from the culture around me, this idea of spiritual emergence, or talking to different people. Like, they often talk about the idea of negative entity attachments, right? And the idea that, like, if you are just going for this thing of like hedonistic party culture, going for chasing pleasure, chasing cheap thrills, all this kind of stuff, that there is some kind of like you're opening yourself to negative spiritual forces. And there's a even with alcohol, the idea that alcohol, they talk about drinking alcohol is like drinking spirits, that like, and people become under the influence of alcohol. It's almost like getting a bit possessed or something like that. Or that there's certain people that, like, when they're drunk, there could be like some kind of a sub-personality that takes over, that isn't there when the person's sober, that does destructive things or something, right? And I was kind of just like going through all this stuff and like thinking about, rather than just Halloween as being a time for hedonism and thrill seeking and all this kind of stuff, that there's some point of resonance where it feels more meaningful, or that there's some part of like where they talk about how at this time of year the veil is thin, right? Or that the day after Halloween is All Saints Day, or the Day of the Dead, and that there's some sort of thing about like communing with the spiritual forces behind the veil, or something like that, or doing seances or something, right? But the thing is, it was kind of interesting is that as I was approaching this problem, it became clear to me that the things are not actually so unrelated, because there's some sort of direct connection between the idea of going out and partying, trying to live it up, have a good time, and then having some kind of there being I don't know, I'm not necessarily, I'm not going to make any positive statements about what did happen or didn't happen in terms of like negative entity attachments or things like that. But there is at some point in time when I was going through this stuff, I sought help from somebody who suggested that if you are looking at this as spiritual emergency, and you're in the state of spiritual emergency or spiritual crisis, it's like best not to just go out and like party, where you're trying to feed your, there's kind of this thing like the realm of hungry ghosts, right? Like you've got all these negative entities on you, and you're just going to be like, I'm just going to feed them lots of drugs and alcohol, or chasing like casual sex or something. Like, it's like kind of like not, you might just attract more of them, or there's some sort of like become a kind of like a magnet for all this like bad energy. And then there's this kind of idea of like schizophrenia of people who are, because this is, I mean, I don't know how much I want to, I'm making this video, I may as well get into it, that like I did when I was having mental health crisis have a lot of problems with hearing voices and stuff like that. And there's like a lot of the voices aren't very, I mean, schizophrenics usually define their voice hearing experience negatively, right? And I was watching an interesting video recently about a guy who was talking about the entities associated with schizophrenia, and that the entities associated with schizophrenia usually are, they're usually mean and bullying or negative, or they also are not, they have an inclination to disrespect religion, or they have an inclination to, which makes them seem kind of demonic, right? And I always had this kind of problem with this idea, because it's like, if you, the way the mainstream psychiatry works is to basically be to not indulge a person in their hallucinations or indulge a person in the beliefs that they build. And basically the strategy is to just try to medicate them with drugs and get them to think about something else, and then to just get them to pay attention to different things, and not to feed the attention to that phenomenon. So I think there may be some wisdom in taking that approach, but then at the same time, even if that helps, it still doesn't answer the question of what is the phenomenon in the first place. And there's a kind of problem, I think, with getting into the thing about like entities and ghosts and demons and stuff like that, is that if you do basically reinforce the idea that there are real demons, is that helpful? Or would that make put a person in more distress and make a person more scared and upset if they reinforce this idea that they actually are literal demonic forces and stuff like that, right? There is another way of looking at it, I think, that there's a movie called Jacob's Ladder, which, to be also kind of like, there's something to me that's kind of eerie or weird or strange personally about Jacob's Ladder, mainly because my dad, who passed away in 2013, was a chiropractor, and Jacob's Ladder really features this chiropractor character, and there's just a guy who's really like a traumatized war veteran who is tormented by this sort of like demonic hallucinations. It's like, I think Jacob's Ladder is a great sort of giving you the feeling of what it's like to be schizophrenic, right? And what it's like to have hallucinations, and what it's like to feel like these things are demonic forces, and what it's like to feel like you're caught in a abusive overly medical system that maybe doesn't understand you or only makes things worse. And there's this chiropractor character in Jacob's Ladder who is sympathetic, and he's a bit an advocate for this guy, but the chiropractor guy has this insight that it's like, well, maybe the demons aren't really demons. Maybe they're just angels helping you to free you from your burdens, right? That they're just like the other side of the angels or something like that, right? And there's something about also Jacob's Ladder is that I remember trying to watch this when I was younger, and maybe before I even had Psychosis, and it didn't make the same impact on me that it did when I was after Psychosis, right? And I think one of the examples in Jacob's Ladder is this scene where the guy, like, this is what I'm thinking, like, there's part of me that when I approach the whole issue of Halloween time and all this kind of stuff, I often just get hung up on this stuff about being isolated, or that it's Halloween so I gotta go and party, but then I'm like, oh yeah, well I try not to party because of all the negative energy that's around partying. And then there's something about watching Jacob's Ladder where there's a scene where the guy goes and parties, and there's some kind of like, it's kind of funny because I guess there's a lot of people who haven't experienced this, right? That, or at least how when I try to go and socialize with other people, like, there's some kind of thing where people don't want sexuality to be demonized, or they don't want their own enjoyment of life to be put down as being sinful or bad or something. And I'm inclined to be sympathetic with them. But then, if you've never experienced this, there's a scene in Jacob's Ladder anyways where the guy goes to a party and like people are getting drunk and playing the music and dancing, and it was all this thing that you would think is like you would associate with a good time, but there's some sort of like energy that takes over that just feels like not good, like it feels off. And it's like in the way that like of a kind of the, you could talk about in terms of the id or the instinctual forces of that is just goes with sexual appetite or being horny or something, which for some reason as an adolescent, I don't know, maybe this is just you just don't, it could be how you're raised or something. I don't know, because like there's at some basic level, like you could be going at the same party perhaps and not experience this as something really off-putting, but then there's some kind of like, I think this maybe goes with the Mercury-Uranus opposition going on, where there's a kind of like breakthrough, or there's a kind of like opportunity for some sort of like insight or revelation or something like that. That there's some kind of like, there's this moment where something cuts through and it's like the people of the party aren't human anymore. They're just like rabid animals, or they're like there's something real bad just like is there. And there's something about growing up as a millennial where I think it's come out, it becomes politicized as cancel culture, I think, right? Where people don't want to be demonized for, wanting to go out and party and get laid and have a good time, and they want to be able to enjoy life without having a guilty conscience, right? But then it comes out that all this awful stuff happens, of like date rape, of you name it, right? I don't need to get into all the details, but there's something about where like you can't look at the party scene so innocently anymore. And there's a sort of kind of moralism that builds up around it. And there's some kind of thing where it's like, I had to like get out of that lifestyle. But there's kind of thing of getting out of that lifestyle makes me feel like I'm kind of just like not in time, or that I've jumped track. Like there's a certain track that most normal people are on, and somehow I jumped track and I'm in some kind of other time stream that is like, in Jacob's Ladder, like the guy's not even alive. The guy is like actually stuck in the underworld, like, or there's a kind of, or it could be either or, it could be open to interpretation. Is the guy stuck in the underworld and the whole thing is just a underworld hellish hallucination, or is it saying that like maybe real life is actually a kind of a dream, that real life is actually kind of an underworld, right? This is what's on my mind going into doing the astrology around this Halloween anyways, right? And I introducing all this topic about the entities of schizophrenia, the spiritual entities that are attracted, or this idea that there's two things about Halloween. There's this kind of surface level, get dressed up and go party and all this kind of stuff. There's this other side of it, which is like, what is the actual truth about spiritual forces, ghosts and demons, the veil being thin, all this other stuff. And and then there's some kind of opportunity, like I'm doing an astrology video, I'm talking like actually making something that is helpful to the culture or making a contribution. Right? So I'm not just sitting here whining and complaining that I'm not going out and partying when that's probably not really good for me in the first place. There's something more recently that I've been exploring certain forms of literature that I previously wasn't really exposed to, and one of these is, I'm taking a risk with this because last time I brought this guy up, it did not do very good for my my numbers on YouTube. This is Eugene Thacker from Zero Books. Except Eugene Thacker, there's a comment made about Eugene Thacker. I don't know if he made it himself, but that he writes the kinds of books that nobody really reads, right? And there's something about that Eugene Thacker seems to have an aura of people not liking him, or maybe because he's too much of a gloomy goth or something like that. But this is the first of his horror philosophy series, In the Dust of This Planet. And there's an idea that I'm just going to read this, and, I'll figure out what I want to say about it after I read it. Thus, in contrast to the anthropological interpretation of the demon, we can consider another one that is mythological. By this term, we imply more than the human understanding of the human, and instead move outwards to the human understanding of the world. The mythological interpretation of the demon takes place less by the use of metaphor and more by the use of allegory, in which the very story of our ability or inability to comprehend the world is encapsulated in the ritual acts of invasion, possession, metamorphosis, and exorcism. This comes through more clearly in one of the classic biblical accounts of demonic possession. That of the so-called Gerasene, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, Gerasene demon. Slightly different accounts are given in Mark 5 and Luke 8, but the basics of the parable are the same. Jesus, with his followers, travels from Galilee to the Gerasene region in northern current-day Jordan. There Jesus is met by the local villagers who appeal to him to heal an old man possessed by demons. The possessed man, it is said, roams about the tombs without clothing or shelter. When the villagers shackle him, he enters into a frenzy and breaks free. At night he screams aloud and cuts himself with stones. Jesus confronts the possessed man, who likewise appeals to Jesus to cure him. As part of the exorcism, Jesus commands the name of the demon possessing the old man. When Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" "My name is Legion," he replied, "for we are many." The name Legion is tricky, for it is not clear from the passage whether it is a single demon speaking in many voices, or if it is a multitude of demons speaking in a single voice. Indeed, the very name Legion appears to devolve upon itself, the name of the many naming itself as one. Jesus then casts the demons out of the body of the old man and into a herd of swine in a nearby hill. The herd of swine now possessed are driven into a state of frenzy and rush over the side of a cliff into the sea below to their death. After this rather dramatic episode, something interesting happens. The villagers, witnessing the entire spectacle, become fearful of Jesus and his healing powers. With some urgency, they politely ask Jesus and his followers to leave the village. In this parable, the demons manifest themselves in three ways, each as an example of the limits of the human to comprehend the non-human. First, this is kind of Thacker's philosophizing. First, within the possessed man, there are a multitude of demons. Demonic possession itself transgresses the normal relationship between the one and the many, one person, one body. It is also an affront to and parody of the Trinity, in which a single one is incarnated in three. God as creator creates many creatures. As creatures, they are linked to God through the act of creation. Yet as creatures, they are also separated from God in their being mortal and rooted in the changes associated with temporality. The multitude of demons in the parable above occupy the individual human creature, that highest of creatures, and turn him into a mere animal-like thing. The iconography of the passage is striking. The true nature of the demons, we presume, is revealed by the choice of their receptacle in a herd of lowly beasts. But throughout this parable, the only real indication we have of this multitude of demons is this enigmatic resounding of the word legion. In philosophical sense, the demons choose to present themselves via voice and sound. At once present and absent is noteworthy. He kind of goes on here. But I thought, basically, a number of things about this is that I have been doing therapy recently in the style of IFS, which promotes the idea of getting away from the mono-mind perspective of looking, rather than seeing yourself as just one person with one mind, the idea that even people who don't have mental illness are carrying around a bunch of different parts, and that you could look at it from an IFS perspective, that just the being Halloween is always triggering this part of me. There's like, I am in my mid-30s and I'm carrying around this like 20-year-old who just wants to go out and party, or that my ego is blending with this part of me from being 20 years old that just wants to party and stuff like this. But there's other kind of thing about the experience of mental illness and the experience of psychosis, and this account from the Bible of a guy, like what the actual experience of going psychotic and hearing a lot of voices, isn't just hearing, like it isn't just, to me the experience didn't seem like the experience of like some child part of me trying to get my attention. It was like an actual legion of a whole bunch of garbage of just like, feeling like your private inner life, your inner conscience is swarmed by the legion of multiple different things. And I actually got into, I've gone to meditation, and I found meditation to be very helpful, because it's kind of like going on this idea that there is a single the highest truth is only found in silence, right? And so that you have a lot of loud, noisy voices of these kinds of fragmentary multiplicities of demons or whatever, but there's this kind of highest truth that is only there in silence, and this is a way of shutting up the kinds of swarms of legions of demons or whatever it is, right? And there's something about this where it's like the paradigm of like schizophrenia or psychosis or bipolar or whatever, they don't really actually know anything about what these voices are or how to deal with them, and they basically just want you to take drugs and try to approach getting rid of voices through medical means. But in my own experience, I was basically able to come on, like I haven't been using psych meds for, what is it? It's been about 8 years now. And I've been able to, but like I'm not entirely, like I still have experienced some things, and I don't necessarily want to like put all of that just out for public consumption, the exact specifics of what I experienced or whatever. But there's this basic kind of, I found that there's a certain kind of resonance though, where the idea of demonic possession being associated with the multitudes, being associated with the legion, and like the whole thing is like when you're doing a whole bunch of drugs at a party, you're like you're dissolving your boundaries and you're opened up to a crowd of a whole bunch of different personalities or different there could be all sorts of stuff that's like just in this multitude, right? And that by not going by being I know this is the kind of problem though, is that I don't necessarily like the idea of living a really isolated lifestyle. And there's this part of me that does want to like have fun and enjoy life, but that is also associated with this risk of like just being immersed into a situation where people are there just to drink, do drugs, get fucked up. There's no higher moral like purpose why you're like, oh, we're going to like good community spirit. Nobody gives a fuck, like it's just like you're in a like there's other kind of quality about it of like just not being able to recognize the water where you're swimming in, right? Where you like you're kind of like, yeah, this is like there's a reason why people look at a seedy dive bar the way it is. I think there's something when you're like young, there's something about like you're like, oh, I'm 19, I get to drink, and I can like, instead of me and my friends raiding the parents' liquor cabinet, we can like, it's a novelty. You can go to the bar, you can go and do this, and there's some kind of like, there's a sort of like youthful naivety where like it doesn't quite register to you that like the seedy bar is a seedy bar for a reason, or that like people. The whole thing about like going to like the nightclub district and having a night on the town, that it's like, I could be just because I was raised in a, like it could be like from a conservative religious point of view, like if you go have a night on the town, it's like a night of sin, of like debauchery, like of like you're just going to like let loose and you're just going to like, it's like live it up and like, but there's something about like, I don't know, just being raised in a culture where there's no judgment that like, okay, so what's the problem? You get drunk, you drink too much, you puke or whatever, or you like, is there a Christian prohibition against like pleasure, right? People want to have pleasure. Is that such a bad thing? Or like people want to have like casual sex outside, hookup culture, right? And then there's all this stuff about like, okay, so what if you go, you're out there to live it up, to raise hell, and like you're not having that good of a time, right? And you're casual, like you're not as good with the ladies as you would have hoped, and you're kind of frustrated. So like there's all this stuff about like, okay, we're gonna have a really good fun time, but we're not having fun, and instead there's just enough stuff to tease you, right? To be like, oh, okay, so I'm supposed to have fun, but it's not really delivering, and it's just kind of aggravating and frustrating, so let's just do more drugs. And then so you get this kind of sense of like all this people like trying to get really high or trying to get really drunk, but they're kind of to get over this sense of being annoyed that they wouldn't be having fun anyways. And then they're sort of like feeding these personalities that are like kind of narcissistic, kind of like the personality that's only out for like self-gratification, and then also frustrated that it can't gratify itself, so it just has to like do more and more drugs or try to do more, and it's just like, or then there's like opens up to all this gross stuff about like date rape culture, and like, which is a serious problem, like and there's all this kind of thing of like, there's part of the reason also why I don't know, like I don't really like living in a white picket fence neighborhood, but if you are living in a neighborhood where people are like somebody who's like a few houses down the street from you, like you get you can live in a kind of boring white picket fence neighborhood where it's just a bunch of like parents raising their kids, and everybody goes to sleep at 9 p.m. and there's nothing fun to do, and you're just living this boring life, and you just go on the internet and play video games, and you want to go and then like there's that, And then, so, like, you could be living in a place where there's lots more cultural things happening, there's lots more things to do at night, all this kind of stuff. But there's also, like, in the neighborhood I was living, stuff would happen where, like, somebody would be raped in their house. Like, somebody would just come in off the street, break in, and rape somebody. And even if I'm a man, and it's very, or like, as just my demographic that I'm less likely for that to happen to, it's like, how did, like, if you're just open, and you're just like in a neighborhood where this is something that happens. You could have somebody getting raped, somebody getting murdered, somebody ODing on the street, somebody like getting abducted, and all this stuff is just happening around you in the background, and you are there. Why? Because I just want to have fun, right? I want to have fun, and in this world where people are getting raped, murdered, all this stuff, it's like there's some kind of thing about like the naive child who's like, oh, I'm just going to go to dive bars and we're just going to be like the hipster, like the indie sleaze. There's some kind of thing where it's like the actual reality of the situation. If you don't understand, like, you're a fish swimming in those waters just kind of naively, like, there's something about it where it's just like, there's something about it too where there's like, your conscious mind filters all this stuff out, and then there's your there's something that as I've been going through all this and working through all this stuff out, there's all this stuff when I was mentally ill that, I'm not entirely against the idea of like labels like schizo bipolar or something like that, in terms of like you are experiencing a different kind of problem than other people experience. But there's something about it where, like, I'm coming to peace with the sense that a lot of the times when I was experiencing distress, or I was experiencing states of being upset about things, that it wasn't like I was, like, I may not have really known or been, like, it could have been something under the surface, but, like, to say that those reactions are inappropriate would be to suggest that we're living in a world that doesn't have all this bad shit happening, right? And, like, if you are in an environment where a lot of bad shit is happening in the periphery that's not immediately in and you are picking up on that, and that is somehow trickling into your conscious mind, and you're doing a bunch of drugs that's opening you up more to it, and you're, oh, there's some, like, voice saying, you better fucking get out of here, this is not, and you're, like, it's like, there's something about, or like, there was also things going on with, I remember after having my psychosis and dropping out, I was very concerned about things like the environmentalism, global warming, climate change, and all that kind of stuff. And apparently, like, I just was reading, I can't remember where this was, maybe it was a podcast or something, but that apparently around the time when I dropped out of that lifestyle, there was a actual huge spike in the amount of emissions, in the amount of pollution, right? And that I was like, I mean, on one hand, I got into meditation practice, and I took a long period of time off of using drugs or whatever, or smoking weed, or, using party drugs, and, like, I just spent some time straightening myself out and getting into meditation. And, I have to say that on one hand it helped to have this being centered into this thing that was, like, transcendent in the sense that it's beyond whatever can be put into language, right? It's some sort of transcendent center that's beyond language, that's some sort of, like, transcendent peace and all this kind of stuff. But there's this, the parts of me that were in distress, or were having a problem, or sometimes the quality of being a doomer, right? Or being like doom and gloom, and being concerned about things, like, looking back on it after the fact. Like, it was also this whole thing about, like, there's all these things which are negative emotions or negative reactions, but they're like, it's not actually crazy to be having these negative emotions and negative reactions, right? It's, if anything, it's more crazy to, like, be living in a kind of this, like, super optimistic thing where you're just like got the blinders on and you're just not seeing the world around you, and you're like why is the world not this like this like funny cartoon thing I have in my head, right? It's like, and that the and then I can go back and watch movies like Jacob's Ladder and be like, oh, I get it now. I was just a dumbass when I was like, like there's so much of this where it's like, and there's also being like, I don't know. I watch a lot of I try to mix up my media diet a bit, but I notice there's a pattern of like the younger generation of Zoomers and stuff like that, and like I can relate to this. Like, you're in a situation where you feel like you want to create something, you feel like you want to like contribute something, you feel like you want to have something to say, but then you kind of realize you don't actually have anything to contribute, right? And it's like, or there's some sort of a block there, and it's like, I know what it's like, and I think part of, for me, where I'm at now, I can look back on myself being that age in my early 20s, feeling that kind of creative block of like either not being sure what, but the point is that I think I literally was a kind of a dumbass, right? Like, I think there's something like, it's like, yeah, you don't know what to say because you haven't got there yet, like, or that you have to like in the same way, like being, let's like, if you're somebody who's like 15 and watching Jacob's Ladder and like nothing about that movie lands, right? Like, you're watching it because you've never been to a party and like, had that experience where you're just like, oh, I'm just want to have like, put on the pop music, have fun, have a good time, and like, YOLO, and like that's the level that everybody lives in. And then once you go through the shit, and then you can watch Jacob Ladder and you're like, oh, I think when you're in the middle of the party and the people around you turn into like inhuman demonic tentacle creatures and you just have to get the fuck out of there, then you're like, oh, I didn't see that. Like, that didn't land for me when I was 15 years old and I was just out to like YOLO. And now that I'm a person who doesn't go and party anymore, because that's why I don't party, and now the movie makes sense, right? And like, there's like, and now I do have something to say because now I'm not a fucking moron. I don't want to put my younger self down, right? But I have to literally just look at the person who I was before I had my spiritual emergence and be like, yeah, I literally was a kind of a dumbass, or like, I want to be kind to my young, naive, younger self who lives in the past, who just wants to party, who like there's some part of me that still identifies with that I'm just a young, naive, young person who just wants to go and party and just wants to have a good time. But the part of me that actually has something to say is not that part. The part that wants to be young and part doesn't really have, you go to the party, you don't really know why you're there. You don't really know what like, you've been told this is a place where you go to just get mindless gratification and seek cheap thrills. But there's no real, if you're like that, the world gives you a place to plug in and try to do that. If you wanted, I mean, I guess what's the alternative? You just hang out at home and read books, which is what kind of, I mean, like, based on the way, I'm kind of in this part of my life where there's less going out to the rave party and more staying home reading books. And there's, with all this grand water Trine, there's at least some emotion about it that I still have to manage this part of me that wants to just socialize and fraternize and all this, but I basically live in Jacob's Ladder world. What can I say, right? And I record these videos to give myself a kind of a creative outlet, so I'm not just like suffocating in this sort of like, there's all this crazy shit that I think about that I can't express to anybody because they'll lock me up, right? That's basically what my life is like. So I don't know. Thanks for watching. I'm keeping on with this. Hopefully you guys like this video. Have a happy Halloween. you know, don't party too hard. All right.